Thank you very much. I don't know whether there is amplification, but do shout out if you can't hear, and I'll speak louder, or also if I speak too quickly, and I'll speak more slowly. So, as Maxim said, I was given this topic Monday last week, the same day as arrived a very large pile of exam scripts, so I apologize that I've not prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but it is our experience that it's actually better not to have one, because with PowerPoints, things appear so quickly that people can't really follow, and the whole thing becomes sort of a bit meaningless, whereas if I write down the main things as I come to them, you can shout out and say and ask for questions, and please do ask questions at any time. Well, I think the topic is a very central one at the present time, and it's a very central problem for economists for two reasons. The first being that the problem is so serious, indeed unprecedentedly serious. The levels of unemployment that have been experienced in the last few years in many European countries are unprecedentedly high. So the first reason is that it's exceptionally serious. Possibly it may turn out to be as serious as the problems in the 1930s, which led, amongst other things, to the accession of a Nazi government in Germany. There's real risks about political breakdown because of the severity of the unemployment. As you know, there's unemployment rates of young people in Mediterranean countries, in Greece and Italy, are in excess of 50%. And in Spain, the overall unemployment rate is in the high 20s. There's very, very high rates of unemployment, exceptionally serious. The second reason, linked to the second half of the title, is that the nature of the problem is different. Namely, that it's now a financial problem rather than a labour market problem. Not labour market. This to some extent means I'm the wrong person to talk about it, because I've done a lot of research on labour markets. I've not really done much research on financial matters. But anyway, that won't stop me. I will proceed notwithstanding. I'd first like even though we've not very much time, I'll even so like to spend just a tiny amount of time on explaining the background, the policy background which has led to this problem. It all, to my mind, is based on an article which has been recognized as a key article in economics for the last 40 years, 50 years even maybe, which is Friedman's article in 1968, the presidential address to the American Economic Association, which introduced the idea of the most famous, perhaps one of the most famous terminologies, the natural rate of unemployment. So this is now policy background, the natural And why was that significant? Well, what did it say? What it said was basically that all this sort of Keynesian stuff and fiddling around with aggregate demand, trying to achieve full employment without inflation and so on, was basically superfluous, because unemployment was a market phenomena. Markets were equilibrating, so that left to itself, the economic system would always converge to some natural rate, some equilibrium rate is perhaps a better way of thinking about it, some equilibrium of unemployment. And the natural rate hypothesis led to two critical issues for policy design, two critical frameworks for policy design. The first being that unemployment was a matter of labour market policy it was a labour market issue. Let's not say it's a matter of labour market policy. But unemployment was a matter for labour markets. If labour markets were working well and functioning efficiently, they would come to an equilibrium with relatively low levels of unemployment. If, on the other hand, there were faults in the labour market, problems in the labour market, then the movement to an equilibrium would be obstructed. So it's just like the housing market or the transport market or any other market, that if if the market worked efficiently, it would clear and there would be no problems, and if the market was obstructed, then it wouldn't. And the type of labour market problems, unemployment was due to labour market problems. The types of labour market problems is what I spent at least 20 years working on, and what they were and how they were to be remedied. And as I say, this is no longer relevant to our current, well, not totally irrelevant, it's not as relevant to our current circumstances. The types of labour market issues were to do with things like whether there were problems with wage bargaining, whether unions, trade unions or other organisations were setting wages at too high a level, so there was insufficient jobs in particular sectors, whether the competition between unions was forcing up the overall level of wages, things of that nature. Whether, a second type of cause, whether the welfare system was too generous, or like whether unemployment benefits were too high, whether there should be more conditionality with unemployment benefits, whether there should be other types of policies for dealing with for unemployed people, other than benefits like training or special work arrangements. So problems of that type. And thirdly, there were issues to do with things like employment protection and minimum wages, the legal interventions in the workings of the market. This is something that employers care a lot about, but didn't seem to have much evidence. But in any event, the focus of policy to deal with unemployment was looking at features of the labour market, asking whether they were empirically relevant, whether they were having an adverse effect, and if they were, considering what could be done about them. And for example, in Britain, there was a big attack on the powers of trade unions. Trade unions were essentially eliminated by Mrs. Thatcher in Britain. By Ronald Reagan in the United States was a great weakening of the powers of unions. But the point was, in any event, that the attack on unemployment, the assault on unemployment, was based on problems within the labour market. And what is now the problem is that whole strategy of attacking unemployment is no longer appropriate. Actually, I'll come back. I'll say that's not entirely true in relation to the United States, but it's certainly true in Europe. But the natural rate of unemployment had another consequence, which was that, what does it mean for monetary policy? Well, what it means for monetary policy is that monetary policy doesn't need to target the unemployment rate, because that's determined by other things. So what should monetary policy do? Well, it can target the inflation rate. And this led to using monetary policy with a single objective to control inflation. Now, if we have labour market policy focused on unemployment and in monetary policy focused on inflation, what about fiscal policy? What's that left to do? We don't need it anymore to sort of control the economy, because the real side is controlled by these labour market policies, controlling unemployment, monetary policy controlling inflation. So fiscal policy was essentially focused on anyone guess? It's fiscal policies about the amount of government borrowing, so fiscal policy can focus on what was called intergenerational equity. That's to say, intergenerational. Really long words, a bit of a nuisance if you're writing them all up. Equity. That's to say, not borrowing too much. if governments finance their spending by borrowing, that essentially means that future generations have to pay the taxes to pay for policy which may be mainly for the benefit of the current generation. Of course, it's a much more complicated issue because some government spending is investment, and in any case, much of it, much borrowing is repaid and so on. Most borrowing is not repaid. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that it was related to issues to do with government debt. Okay, so those were the labour market problems. I think, without sort of being too sort of nostalgic, and this policy design was, in fact, unusually successful. These objectives were achieved better over the period, say, from the early 1990s up to 2007, 2008. It was one of the most successful eras in terms of macroeconomic management, at least for most advanced market economies, America and Western Europe and so on. Very successful. Unemployment was declining, inflation was low, government debt was largely declining, and output was growing. These were years, the 20 years, well, not 20, but nearly 20, close on 20 years, from 1990 up to 2007 and 8, were really a good time in terms of economic policy. Most countries did much better on most objectives during those years than they have done before or since. So this was a good. So basically, these policies that grew out of the natural rate of unemployment were very successful up until the financial crash. I'm not going to say anything about the causes of the crash. I mean, obviously it's because the banks made a lot of bad loans, and that when they crashed, the government had to bail them all out, and that created a lot of debt in the government. But I think so the question is, so the crash led to a sharp decline in aggregate demand. So what happened to this natural rate issue? Why didn't the natural rate argument work? Why didn't the economies revert back to full employment, or at least natural rate of unemployment? Why didn't the economies move back towards the equilibrium rate of unemployment, which the natural rate of unemployment hypothesis thinks that they should have done? And the answer is essentially a very Keynesian answer. The answer is the liquidity trap. The crash, there's two things really. Firstly, the inflation targeting had been so successful that inflation was low, nominal interest rates were low, so that the economy would have to adjust to a big adverse shock by a sharp decline in interest rates. That is the way it would work. But if the interest rate's already too low, if the interest rate's already low, it is impossible to achieve the monetary impulse that is necessary, because what is nowadays called the zero bound, the fact that nominal interest rates can't be negative, which in the old days was called the liquidity trap, nowadays called the zero bound. I'll write zero bound to be modern. Zero bound. Okay, so we had low interest rates, negative, I would say large negative shock. And so the economy economies with low interest rates subject to large negative shocks, monetary policy cannot re-equilibrate them. And the reasons for that, as it were, are set out in the 1930s when Keynes wrote the general theory about the question whether monetary policy could always save the day. And he thought liquidity trap didn't happen in the 1930s, but it certainly happened in the 2008. So the zero-bound policies, the zero-bound on negative interest rates broke the natural rate of unemployment and meant that all this group of policies had no longer a sound basis for them because of this. So what happened next? I'll just contrast the United States with Europe. The United States, new President Barack Obama, the United States went Keynesian. So, giving up these things, the United States chose to have not only as expansionary monetary policy as possible with a zero bound. The Fed was at the forefront of central banks which cut interest rates to zero and which went in for unorthodox monetary policies such as quantitative easing. That means lowering long-term interest rates as well as short-term interest rates, but also importantly tolerated a very big increase in the budget deficit. So the United States was, notwithstanding all the sort of political fuss, did actually have for a long time a big budget deficit intentionally, as a result of which there was some growth. So the United States went for these Keynesian policies and endeavored to use fiscal as well as monetary policy to get the economy back to equilibrium. And it had growth. This is simplifying a bit. Now, it's true that unemployment has not fallen very much in the United States despite the growth, although it's much, much lower than in other countries. Well, the United States unemployment is around, I think, 7-8%, as against over 12% in Europe. One issue that came back, as it were, to bite them was that one of the things that the United States did in order to help out in this deep slump was to extend the duration of unemployment benefits from 26 weeks to nearly 2 years in some places, in some states, different between different states, but up to 2 years. And this is one policy which is well known to be likely to raise the natural rate of unemployment. So there was as it were, a labour market problem slightly coming back to hit them from having this expansion. All the unemployment in the all the increase in unemployment in the United States is long-term unemployment, and it may well be linked up to this extension in the entitlements for benefits, which are now being taken away through the sequestration, but unfortunately that's combined with cutting back all sorts of other things. So just as there's more pressure on people to find jobs, at the same time some jobs are being taken away. So the United States may have been forced to abandon this policy by the sequester, whatever it's called, sequestration of government spending, which has been imposed, which was sort of invented 2 years ago, which Congress has failed to cancel, and which is therefore coming into effect. But the United States is different. In Europe, I can turn this on. Yes. In Europe, so I may want to come back to. No, so I can cut it. Oh, we've got these nice pictures. Oops. Okay, in Europe, In Europe, by contrast, in the make sure I've got where I am with my notes. In Europe, we basically got stuck for slightly different reasons in the UK against the Eurozone countries, but essentially, I'll just very quickly talk about, just mention the UK. In the UK, the government has, unlike the government of the United States, made cutting the budget deficit a priority. That seems to be a political decision, but anyway, it has decided on fiscal austerity. This is an entirely home-based decision. It's something that the UK government has decided, but combined with loose money. So it's doing all it can with regard to cutting interest rates and so on, but money is not enough because of the liquidity trap. Just the same as the United States. So the government's policies don't really, they don't add up because they are relying entirely on money, but money is too weak a instrument to save the economy in this situation. It's the exact Keynesian sort of analysis. But in the Eurozone, the other European countries, where unemployment is a much more severe problem, in the Eurozone, unemployment, as I said at the beginning, is over 12%, which is very high. And it's basically getting worse. And there's two things about the Eurozone that sort of need to be taken into account. How is it? What is going on? In the Eurozone, fiscal austerity is imposed on countries rather than them choosing it. So they have to sign up for fiscal austerity. But in the Eurozone, essentially, everything is based around this sovereign debt problems. So let me just mention. So why? So this is because a lot of Eurozone countries. It's got slightly disorganized. Never mind. The sovereign debt problem is that a number of Eurozone governments have debts which now exceed the amount they are likely to be able to repay. The issue with debt is that once it reaches a certain level, because of the burden of paying interest on it, it essentially becomes impossible to stop it shooting off out of control. It becomes sort of like a Ponzi game. There's no way you can pay your current liabilities because of having a high level of debt. The interest payments become large. You can't raise the money to pay it. You borrow more, the debt gets bigger. People get worried, they put up a higher interest rate, and the thing spirals off out of control. So with sovereign debt, irrespective of whether you spent the money on good things or not, there comes a time when if the amount of debt you hold exceeds the capacity to generate a primary budget surplus to pay it off, it just grows out of control. And once people think it's growing out of control, obviously they don't want to hold it. It crashes on the markets, the governments can't finance their spending, and the country is bankrupt. So sovereign debt is a real problem, and within the Eurozone, it's particularly a problem because it affects the capacity of countries to remain within the Eurozone. And so within the Eurozone, countries have needed, Eurozone countries that wish to stay within the Eurozone have needed to negotiate mechanisms to borrow more money officially to protect them from these runaway sovereign debt problems. So how did these sovereign debt problems arise? So that's what leads the Eurozone to be imposing the fiscal austerity. How did the sovereign debt problems arise? Well, basically there's two ways, one of which is specific to a number of particularly smaller countries, the other is much more general. The specific problem for some countries that caused this was bank rescues. And this is, for example, the case in Ireland, to a lesser extent in Spain, to some extent, well, more recently also in Cyprus earlier this year. So had Chris Pisarides accepted your invitation, he probably would have turned it down on the grounds that he's now advising the president of Cyprus on trying to cope with this problem. But essentially it arises where you have a country with a large banking sector, which the cost of bailing it out just shifts onto the balance sheet of the government more debt than it can afford to repay. And you get countries like Ireland or Iceland or indeed others, Cyprus, where the banking sector's liabilities are several times the size of the nation's GDP, so that when the government has to rescue the bank, its debt shoots up from like some sensible thing like 50% of GDP to 250% or something, and it then can't repay. And what does the Eurozone do in those circumstances? What the Eurozone does is tell it to cut its government spending, to raise taxes, and then it lends it some money. And the problem is, of course, that the impact of, or the risk is, that the impact of the fiscal austerity is to depress economic activity and weaken the capacity of the government to repay the debt rather than strengthen it. In these small countries that typically doesn't happen, because if you take a country like Ireland, it's a small country, most of its GDP is exported, so cutting demand doesn't actually have much impact on supply, because most of the stuff is exported. So small economies can get away with this. So Ireland, for example, has improved its fiscal position through austerity. But this is one of the causes. The other cause, which is I spend a little more time on because it's a bit more interesting, is sort of competitiveness problems. And this runs to the heart of the whole Eurozone structure. And let me just say, when the Eurozone was being set up, there's a lot of discussion in the UK whether the UK should become join the Eurozone, abandon pounds and start having euros. And I recall particularly a seminar which we organised in '97, just after the Blair government had been elected, but before the final decisions on joining the Eurozone were made. And there were a couple of papers about this, one by Charlie Bean, now Deputy Governor of Bank of England, one by Willem Bouter, now Chief Economist at Citibank. They were both at LSE at the time. And they both said, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter whether you join the Eurozone or not. And of course this was a surprise because, there was Mundell optimal currency area, quite stringent conditions are necessary for it to be optimal to join a currency area. Labour mobility, no asymmetric shocks, that sort of thing. But they argued, yeah, that's true. We do need flexibility of real exchange rates between economies because there are asymmetric shocks and there isn't labour mobility. But you can achieve flexibility of real exchange rates, not by having flexibility of nominal exchange rates, but by flexibility of wages and prices. And in the 90s it was believed, with all this nice stuff going on, that there was sufficient flexibility of wages and prices for shocks to competitiveness can be resolved. And just to take an example, if a country well, I'll take Greece as an example because this is the key current country in this area. If Greece found that it was becoming less competitive, then demand for its products would decline, the economy would become more stagnant, and the reaction would be that wages and prices should decline relative to the other Eurozone countries, and they would go on declining until the competitiveness was restored. So the answer was that shifts in competitiveness would be offset by movements of relative wages and prices. Well, why didn't that happen? Well, first, it wasn't entirely clear the evidence was correct, or there was sufficient flexibility to deal with the big changes that might hit Eurozone countries. But a more important question, more important issue, or a more important factor was that where there were changes in competitiveness, and they did lead to a decline in demand, what tended to happen was that far from seeing adjustments of wages and prices, we saw budget deficits. So the government would deal with a decline in demand coming from the export sector by spending more, by spending money, creating jobs, cutting taxes, stimulating the economy. So a decline in competitiveness was offset by a budget deficit. And this was made possible by, almost made more attractive by the fact that within the Eurozone everybody had the same currency, therefore everybody had the same interest rate, therefore budget deficits could be financed very cheaply. So until the time of the financial crash, the Greek government, though it was borrowing lots of money, could borrow at the same rate as the German government. So these deficits could be easily financed because the markets didn't distinguish between the deficits of different Eurozone countries. So this also leads back to why fiscal austerity was imposed, because it's necessary to enable the adjustment mechanism to work. If you're into a single currency zone, the only way that markets can be equilibrated, balance can be achieved, is through flexibility of domestic wages and prices, and this having individual countries having budget deficits will interfere with that, will prevent that from coming about. So what sort of happens next? Well, the ECB has abandoned the pretense that the Eurozone was doing okay. The ECB is now indulging in loose money like the best of them, like the Fed, like the Bank of England, like the Bank of Japan. So the Eurozone has shifted in the last year or so to loose money, to very loose money. But of course it's even less adequate a tool in the Eurozone than it is in the UK, because the Eurozone has all these other problems which the UK doesn't have. Well, the UK does have the bank rescue problem a bit, but it's not as bad as some Eurozone countries. What is to be done? The problem of can the adjustment? There's two. I suppose there's two. One is there in principle, is it possible to imagine the adjustment process working if the institutions were set up differently? But secondly, because there's such big failures of competitiveness at the moment that even if adjustment of a few percent a year is no good if the competitiveness is 50% out or something like that. And the general situation at the moment is that even these very, very high unemployment rates are not restoring the equilibrium between the Eurozone countries at anything like a rapid enough rate. So one has a situation where because of this competitiveness, some economies in Europe, particularly the German economy, are doing well. They're highly competitive because of the situation with the Eurozone as a whole. The German industry has a strong competitive advantage in international markets because you're using euros, which are essentially the value of the euro is essentially pulled down by these other countries. So the German industry is doing very well. There was nothing in Germany causing them to wish to expand their economy or allow the ECB to expand monetary policy in Europe. The ECB last summer actually had to reach a policy decision against the vote of its German representative, which is a completely unprecedented event. So the Germans don't accept the small amounts of improvement in monetary policy in the Eurozone, small expansionary effects in the Eurozone. And in fiscal policy, the Germans are, because they're doing well in competitiveness, so they want budget, they're happy to have move their budget into surplus. Although, of course, that weakens the level of demand in the Eurozone as a whole. So basically, the asymmetries within the Eurozone and the lack of competitiveness of the current extreme lack of competitiveness makes it very difficult to see how, from where we are now, the equilibrium can be restored. And if it can't be restored, it equally seems very difficult to see how the political framework in many of these countries can hold these very serious problems without some sort of collapse. And this has been seen in countries like Italy, where the political system, which was never very good at the best of times, has sort of collapsed with clowns and that winning the election. And in other countries, sort of not very serious political parties have done very well in elections. And the public seems to have abandoned the belief that there's any way of steering its way out of this crisis. But it does seem that at least one way out, which is at least clear that it could work, is by coming apart of the Eurozone. And the more one looks at it, it's difficult to see how there is anything else that can work other than that. I think as we have no much more time, so just the conclusion that one will come to is that unless there's a sort of change in a policy perspective throughout the Eurozone, and particularly in Germany, with a policy priority of restoring growth and avoiding the current unemployment problem, which is caused by this deficiency of demand, which is a result of the fiscal austerity which they're imposing. Well, it's not the result. The fall in demand is caused by the crash, but the failure of the economies to adjust to it is caused by the fiscal austerity. Unless there's a change in the policy perspective throughout Europe, and in particular in Germany, to confront that problem, then I cannot see how the Eurozone can hold together. And I'm not an expert on German politics, but my understanding is that there is no support in Germany for a change in policy priorities, no change in perspective. So how long will all this take? It's very difficult to say. I mean, the markets have been expecting a breakup for a while. It's not happened. The politicians have held it together, but they've held it together in a way which hasn't done anything to address the underlying problems. For example, the European Central Bank introduced this new policy, outright monetary transactions, which is the same as quantitative easing, which is basically a way of lowering interest rates. But it was only available for countries which signed up to more austerity. So even though it was giving a slight relief on the monetary side, it was accompanied by more austerity on the fiscal side. So, and that was required by the German member. So it seemed to me that the problem of unemployment, which is, I think it is unprecedentedly serious, it is unusually difficult, requires economic policies quite different from what we have seen and needed in the past, but has led within the Eurozone to a sort of impasse, a difficulty so severe that I don't see how the unemployment problem can be solved while the Eurozone remains in place. Okay, so that's your right number of minutes. It gives you a few moments for questions if anyone has any.
So it sounds like we should be the Eurosceptic.
No, please ask.
Okay, questions, please. Can I ask the first question that now people are making up their mind? I'm just curious, what do you have to say about, well, as you said, in Spain and Greece, the unemployment is particularly severe, and maybe Hakan knows better, like firsthand. Hakan came from Spain, basically, from the Spanish university. Well, is it true that many people start basically, there is an upcoming problem of migration of labor out of Greece and out of Spain and into Britain in particular, and that will probably alleviate somehow, to some extent, unemployment in, well, say, especially in Spain, because there are links between two countries to some degree. So, will it help the governments to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the migration is, of course, very much being analysed nowadays. It's within the Eurozone there is free migration. People can go to other Eurozone countries, and not only the Eurozone, sorry, within the EU. People can move to other EU countries and are entitled to work, not just to move and live there, they're entitled to work. So it's perfectly possible for a Greek or Spanish person to come to Germany or Britain or France or Sweden or somewhere and can start working, and is counted from a labour market point of view as equivalent to a native citizen. The levels of migration as of now from Greece haven't been very high, but Spanish is more of an issue. The normal problem is that apart from casual activities like working in bars and restaurants and such like, people need qualifications, and there's a lack of harmonization of qualifications between European countries. So if, like, you trained as a plumber in Spain, you couldn't get a job as I don't know, it may not be true, but as an example, if you trained as a plumber or something like that in Spain, and you wouldn't be able to get a job as a plumber in the Netherlands because you need to have done different certificates and the like. And of course, language is still a very big difficulty in terms of people being acceptable, like in like, for example, in the medical profession, it's not only that the countries may not accept other countries' qualifications for being a doctor or something, but if you can't actually speak the language, you're not actually going to be able to be very effective as a doctor or as some other person needing close integration. We did hear that the Germans are actually setting up specific vocational training arrangements for people from Spain and other southern European countries to enable them to not only to acquire relevant qualification or qualifications that would be accepted, plus also learning a language so they could actually function effectively in slightly higher level occupations. It seems a bit wrong. It seems a bit the wrong way around. It's true that there's a shortage of labour in Germany and so on, but why should people have to move to different parts of the world to get jobs just because the country signed up to the wrong exchange rate? That seems somehow to be putting the idea of joining the euro was to improve people's welfare, not force them to go and live in other countries, which they wouldn't otherwise have wanted to do. So, you know, I don't like the idea of labour migration as a solution. I know in Mundell's analysis, labour migration was seen as a defining characteristic of optimal currency areas, but I think that was intending to say that, you know, if people are free to move, are happy to move around already, so they're moving around even already between these countries, then you know, that will enable these countries to cope with the shock, asymmetric shocks. Not that, you know, it was something that was intrinsically to be encouraged. In Britain, there is unfortunately rather overdone immigration, or this feeling that immigration from Eastern Europe has been rather overdone, which was largely due to a big miscalculation about the effects of Poland, the Polish. The accession countries, as countries join the EU, there is a sort of accession period, and they don't get this free mobility immediately. And there were, I think, 7 or 8 countries which joined in 2001, which had this free mobility as from 2005 or something, and the consequences of that were not well estimated. But I think yeah, I mean, I'm very happy. You know, I've got nothing against people migrating, but I don't think it's good that they should migrate just because the policy framework is not working.
A couple of weeks ago, Latvia joined the Eurozone. Yes. Are they met or not?
Sorry?
Are they met or not? Latvia.
Yeah, right.
Joined the Eurozone.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Or 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Since they are met. No?
So I don't quite. We're not quite.
Are they met or not?
Are they mad? Are they crazy or not?
Oh, who? But the Germans?
No. Latvia. Well, the question is like Latvia.
Oh, Latvia joined. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I just didn't get the right word. Latvia joined. You say crazy. I think. I think the some small countries have not had. Okay, so why have some countries got these problems and others not? The basic causes here are, I think, to some extent bound up with the crisis. That Latvia has suffered very severely during the crisis. It had a very sharp decline in economic activity, it had an adjustment process, and it might reasonably feel it couldn't have been worse even if it had been within the EU. It suffered, Latvia had whoops, and then the wages and prices adjusted, and it has recovered quite well, given how big the fall has been, it's recovered quite quickly, but it's still, it still suffered a lot. So I think Latvians might well take the view that doing it themselves, they couldn't do, nothing could be worse than what they went through anyway. I think the risk that they have of is not the same as in Greece. I don't see that there's any particular reason to think they'll get impaled on too high a level of wages and prices. The question I didn't address, which was sort of hidden away behind all this, is okay. Suppose we start again. Say, let's have Euro 2, put all the exchange rates, revalidate, sort of in some way adjust the price. I don't know quite how to do this, but adjust something or other. Have a new currency. No. What we could have, what I mean by this, which is a hypothetical experiment. Say there was a new currency issued. And say, when it was issued, you looked at the wages and prices in each country in relation to purchasing power parity or some other thing, and adjusted, so the value of this new currency in each country was different relative to the old currency because it was based on some sort of purchasing power parity. What then would happen to the interest rates? Because now we have a system where, at least in principle, countries will be able to try to keep in line with a new euro. Will interest rates in all countries then be the same? Why not? Because this is a system where there will be no defaults because the countries will be able to adjust. If there's going to be no defaults, then interest rates are going to be everywhere the same. If interest rates are going to be everywhere the same, will not the same temptations to spend your way out of a recession reoccur? And if they reoccur, will that not destroy the system? So I'm sort of, this is all very hypothetical, but in other words, the question I'm asking is, even if Latvia is able to have enough wage and price flexibility and has already dealt with its banking crisis, so it can cope with remaining competitive with Germany, if other member nations can't, isn't this system going to blow up again? And if it's going to blow up, who wants to be in a system that's going to blow up? I think that was a question I was trying to answer, which I wasn't answering quite right. But so I think I would be prepared to accept that, given the adjustments the Latvians have made, they will be able to achieve to remain competitive with Germany, because they will be prepared to put up with wage cuts as they've done in the past. The question whether if what I'm predicting, which is the Eurozone will collapse, is true, is it sensible to join it? Yes, it doesn't seem to be terribly sensible. I agree, but it's not. It's a punt. It does seem, it doesn't seem to be a good idea.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. You just mentioned at the beginning of your presentation the example of Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
My question deals with the problem of this causal connection between high level of employment and crisis development and escalation of the crisis. It was quite clearly for this period of time, and I'm quite curious about the kind of way of thinking of this causal connection. If right now we have this causality between high level of employment and a kind of crisis escalation and politicization of right-wing movement and so on. Because in Russia, it was a very popular figure of explanation, a kind of metaphor of Weimar whirlpool, and even Niall Ferguson uses this idea that in his analysis of crisis in Russia, but we doesn't have now, to my knowledge, in our literature, didn't find that right now there is this causal connection. What do you think of this possibility to explain and predict development, this causal connection between high level of employment and escalation of crisis and fall of democracy?
I wouldn't actually claim that I believe there was, because obviously the history of Germany in the 1920s was very unstable because of the hyperinflation. But during the end of the 20s, there was a recovery in Germany. That it was a financial crisis which was initiated in America, a Wall Street crash, which caused the German economy suddenly to collapse. In the 1930-31, and of course the accession of Hitler was not entirely achieved through an election, but there were other non-democratic means whereby the power was centralized into one person, which was not very democratic. Both the means and the outcome were not very democratic. So I think to say that just because there's a financial crisis and high unemployment, that would be the end of democracy is far from far from the truth, but I mean, I'm just illustrating that when one gets a financial crisis, things, and it does disrupt the economy, then, the worst case, as it were, the worst case thing that could happen was like what happened in Germany in 1931-32, and it certainly, I mean, it didn't happen in America. There was no fascist movement in America, so it's not by no means inevitable, but certainly worrying, I would say. And it's clear that there is enormous dissatisfaction on part of the electorates in many Western European countries with their existing political parties. In America, even the sort of Tea Party movement is complete lack of confidence in the established Republican Party, understandable perhaps, but anyway, in Britain there's this new UKIP party which is eroding the support from the government. In Italy, the Five Star movement. In Greece, there has been a fascist party becoming quite powerful. So I think it's nothing like as serious as the 1930s, but it's not to be ignored, or not something to say there's nothing to worry about. I think it's just difficult to this sort of collapse into irrationality is rather difficult to cope with. It's not like these clowns have got. It's not the case that the existing politicians, though they haven't been perhaps fantastic, then they're not corrupt or uninformed or.
Right now, you don't see any connection between possible crisis and escalation of this crisis and any numbers of unemployment, because in many cases in Russia it is a very low level of.
Russia is.
So even that we have experienced crisis.
We
have experienced it over the last 20
years.
Doesn't realize in any violent scenario.
No, I think the background in Russia is obviously very different. I think yes, you're right. The financial crisis in Russia, though. Russia had its own financial crisis in 1998, and it hasn't really been as seriously affected by the 2008 crisis as many other countries. I'm not saying it's not been affected, but certainly it hasn't fed through into higher levels of unemployment in the way that's happened in other countries. So I think, which isn't, I know it said Europe, but I was sort of thinking of Western Europe. I wouldn't presume to comment about. I think it's. I think these historic, because the situation is without precedent. Well, that's quite how I would put it. Because we are very unfamiliar with these types of circumstances, because it's unprecedented since the end of the war. It's natural to look back to historical episodes which have much in common, and to sort of get warned by them. Thank you.